"Look at her, sir. She's smiling," the maid's toddler whispered after the fiancée cut her mother's hair, and the billionaire froze. She cut off her hair in front of everyone, and smiled while she did it. Nobody said a word. Nobody moved. Then a 3-year-old girl pointed at her mother. "Look at her, sir," she whispered. "She's smiling." Not one person in that room understood what she meant. Not yet. What would you do if the person you trusted most humiliated someone in front of your own eyes? The billionaire froze. His glass slipped from his hand. Because in that moment, a toddler saw something no adult in that mansion had noticed in years. And it was about to change everything. This story will make you question who really deserves your trust. And stay until the end because the last 30 seconds of this one will stay with you for a long, long time. Let's begin. The smell of lemon polish always meant one thing in the Whitfield house. Yolanda was awake before the sun. Every morning at 5:40, before the birds even started their noise over Brookhaven Estate, Yolanda Price moved through the marble halls of the Whitfield mansion like she'd built the place herself. In a way she had. 10 years of her hands on every doorframe, every windowsill, every crystal chandelier. 10 years of her voice humming old church songs low enough not to wake anyone, but loud enough to keep herself company. She was 42 years old, and she had exactly one photograph taped inside her locker in the staff room. A little girl, 3 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on a porch step in a yellow dress 2 sizes too big. Her daughter, Nia. "Morning, Miss Yolanda." The voice belonged to Marcus, the head groundskeeper, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s who'd worked the estate even longer than she had. He was carrying a rake over one shoulder like a rifle, off to deal with the leaves that dared to fall on Mr. Whitfield's lawn overnight. "Morning, Marcus. Coffee's on if you want a cup before you start. You're a blessing, you know that?" Yolanda just smiled and kept walking. She didn't need to be told. She knew her worth, even if nobody in that big house ever said it out loud. Nathaniel Whitfield, Nathan to the few people alive who dared call him that, was 45 years old and owned more real estate than some small countries. He'd built an empire out of steel and glass towers, and somewhere along the way, he'd stopped noticing the people who kept his own house standing. He wasn't a cruel man. He was a distracted one. The kind of rich that made a person forget what a grocery store even looked like. He said thank you to Yolanda maybe twice a year, usually around the holidays, usually in passing, usually already halfway out the door to another meeting in another city. That morning, he came down the grand staircase in a suit that cost more than Yolanda made in 2 months, talking on the phone about a deal in Singapore, and he walked straight past the little girl sitting cross-legged on the hallway rug. Nia didn't seem to mind. She never did. She was busy building a wobbly tower out of wooden blocks that Yolanda kept in a bin under the kitchen sink, just for the days she couldn't find a sitter and had to bring her daughter to work. "Nia baby, stay right there, okay? Mama's got to finish the West Wing." "Okay, Mama." The girl didn't look up from her blocks. Yolanda had raised her alone since Nia was 6 months old. Nia's father had made promises he never intended to keep, and then he'd made himself scarce, and Yolanda had done what she always did. She got up and she went to work and she made it work. She never once let her daughter see her cry about it. Not once. It was Marcus who'd first mentioned there might be someone new around the house soon. "Heard Mr. Whitfield's got himself engaged," he said one afternoon, wiping sweat off his brow after trimming the hedges. "Some woman named Bianca. High society type. Big wedding coming." Yolanda hadn't thought much of it. Rich men got engaged. Happened. Her job was the same either way. Keep the house spotless, keep the silver polished, keep her head down and her daughter fed. She met Bianca Sterling for the first time on a Tuesday in early spring. Bianca swept into the foyer in a cream-colored coat, sunglasses pushed up into hair so perfectly styled it looked like it had never once been touched by wind. She was 32, sharp-jawed, and beautiful in the calculated way that took effort to look effortless. "You must be the housekeeper," Bianca said, not quite looking at Yolanda. Her eyes instead sweeping the entryway like she was already redecorating it in her head. "Yolanda Price, ma'am. Pleasure to meet you. Bianca handed over her coat without another word, as though Yolanda were a coat rack that happened to speak. Yolanda took it without comment. She'd learned a long time ago that some people needed to feel important, and her job wasn't to fight that. Her job was to keep this house running so she could keep her daughter fed and clothed and safe. Pride didn't pay rent. But there was something in the way Bianca's eyes had flicked, just for a second, toward Nia sitting on the rug with her blocks. Something cold and assessing, like she was cataloging an inconvenience, that made the hair on Yolanda's arms rise. She dismissed the feeling. She had floors to mop. Later that week, Yolanda found herself training Bianca's new personal assistant, a nervous young woman named Priya who kept apologizing for asking too many questions. "Miss Sterling wants the guest wing repainted before the wedding," Priya said, flipping through a binder thick with swatches and vendor contracts. "And she wants it done without bothering Mr. Whitfield with the details." "Everything gets run past Mr. Whitfield eventually," Yolanda said carefully. "That's how it's always worked here." "Not anymore, apparently." Priya lowered her voice, glancing toward the hallway. "She told me herself. His signature is a formality. She makes the decisions now." Yolanda filed that away with the rest of the small, uneasy things she'd started collecting without meaning to. A house this large ran on trust, and trust, she was beginning to understand, was being quietly redirected away from the man who owned it. She thought of her own mother sometimes on nights like these, a woman who'd cleaned other people's houses in Georgia for 30 years and told her, more than once, "Baby, the folks with money don't always have the sense God gave a goose. Somebody's got to keep their eyes open for them." Yolanda had laughed at that as a girl. She wasn't laughing now. That evening, after Nathan had gone to bed and the house had gone quiet, Yolanda sat at the kitchen table with Nia asleep against her shoulder, and she noticed something small. A torn photograph in the kitchen trash. Torn carefully, deliberately, right through the middle. A picture of Nathan's late mother, the woman whose portrait had hung in the east hallway for as long as Yolanda had worked there. Yolanda fished it out, smoothed it flat, and tucked it into her apron pocket without knowing exactly why. She told herself it was nothing. Just an old photo somebody didn't want anymore. She was wrong. But she wouldn't understand how wrong for a long time yet. Have you ever ignored a warning sign because you didn't want it to be true? The first time Yolanda felt truly uneasy, it wasn't anything Bianca said. It was something she didn't. 3 weeks after the engagement was announced to the household staff, Bianca began appearing in the kitchen at odd hours, opening drawers, running a manicured finger along countertops like she was inspecting a hotel room she planned to complain about later. "This silver needs to be replaced," she told Yolanda one afternoon, holding up a fork like it had personally offended her. "It's dated. That silver belonged to Mr. Whitfield's grandmother, ma'am." "Exactly my point." Yolanda said nothing. She'd learned that silence was often the safest response in a house that wasn't hers. Marcus noticed the shift too. "She's rearranging the whole east garden," he told Yolanda one evening, shaking his head. "Ripped out your rose bushes, the ones Mrs. Whitfield planted before she passed. Didn't ask nobody. That's not our house to protect, Marcus. Feels like somebody ought to." Yolanda didn't answer that one. She just went back to folding towels, the way she always did when a conversation got too close to a truth she didn't want to look at directly. Money started disappearing from the household budget in small amounts, a few hundred here, a catering deposit there, always explained away by Bianca as wedding expenses, always signed off without question by Nathan, who was too buried in his Singapore deal and his Tokyo acquisition and his 14-hour days to notice that his fiancée had quietly taken over every financial decision in the house. One evening, Yolanda walked past the study and overheard Bianca on the phone. Her voice pitched low and sharp. "I told you once the wedding happens, none of this will matter." He signs whatever I put in front of him. He trusts me completely. Oz. Short, cold laugh. The house staff. Please. Nobody listens to the help. Yolanda stood frozen in the hallway, a stack of folded towels pressed against her chest, and for one long moment, she considered walking straight into that study and repeating every word back to Nathan herself. It wasn't fear exactly. It was math. She was a black woman, 42 years old, a single mother with one photograph of her daughter taped inside a locker, and a landlord who didn't care about excuses. She had learned the hard way more than once in her life what happened to women like her when they spoke up against people like Bianca. She had learned that, she said, rarely favored the maid. So she walked away. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself Nathan was a grown man who could figure out his own fiancée. She told herself a lot of things that spring. The moment that should have warned her, the moment she'd later replay over and over in her mind, came on a rainy Thursday when Nia had a fever and no sitter was available. Yolanda brought her daughter to work, tucked into a blanket on the small cot in the laundry room, and checked on her between chores. Bianca found the girl there during one of her house inspections. "What is this?" Bianca's voice was flat, unreadable. "My daughter's sick, ma'am. I couldn't leave her home alone. I promise she won't be any trouble, she's sleeping. This is a working household, Yolanda. Not a daycare. It won't happen again." Bianca looked down at Nia for a long moment, long enough that Yolanda's stomach tightened without knowing why, and then she smiled. A small, private smile that didn't reach her eyes. "See that it doesn't." She walked away without raising her voice, without making a scene, and Yolanda told herself it was over. Just a warning. Just a boundary being drawn. But something about that smile stayed with her all day, like a splinter she couldn't quite dig out. That night, folding laundry alone in the quiet, Yolanda pulled the torn photograph of Nathan's mother out of her apron pocket, the one she'd rescued from the trash weeks ago, and she taped the two halves back together with a strip of clear tape. She didn't know why she'd kept it. She didn't know why she felt the need to hide it in the bottom of her purse instead of just leaving it in the drawer where it belonged. She just knew, somewhere underneath the part of her mind that made excuses, that something in this house had started to rot. A few days later, Marcus caught her sitting alone in the pantry during her break, staring at nothing. "You all right?" he asked, setting down a crate of tomatoes from the garden. "Just tired, Marcus. You know you can talk to me. 30 years I've worked for this family. I've seen housekeepers come and go, groundskeepers too. I've never seen you look like this." Yolanda considered telling him everything. The phone call she'd overheard, the money moving in odd directions, the cold smile Bianca had given Nia in the laundry room. But some old, tired part of her held back. Speaking it out loud would make it real. And real meant she'd have to do something about it. And doing something about it meant risking the only steady paycheck she had. "It's nothing," she said instead. "Just a long week." Marcus didn't push. But before he left the pantry, he set a small jar of peach preserves on the counter beside her, something his wife had canned that summer, and said quietly, "Well, whatever it is, you're not as alone in this house as you might think." It was a small kindness, the kind Yolanda had learned not to expect from anyone in that mansion besides Marcus. She held onto it the way she held onto most things that mattered to her. Quietly, and without letting anyone see how much it helped. That weekend, Bianca called an impromptu staff meeting in the kitchen, the first time she'd ever addressed the household staff directly. She stood at the head of the long steel prep table in a blazer that probably cost more than the table itself, and she laid out new rules. Staggered break times, a dress code update, a policy that children were no longer permitted anywhere on the property under any circumstances, sick day or not. Nobody argued. Nobody ever argued with Bianca. But Yolanda noticed, watching from the back of the room, that Bianca's eyes found hers exactly once during the entire announcement, and held there just a beat too long, like a warning aimed at a single target dressed up as a policy for everyone. Would you have trusted Bianca, too, if the rent depended on it? The night of the engagement party was supposed to be simple. 50 guests, string lights across the back terrace. A string quartet. Nathan had flown in from the city. Yolanda had spent 4 days preparing that house until it gleamed. She hadn't planned on bringing Nia. But the sitter cancelled at 6 o'clock, and the party started at 7, and Yolanda had exactly one option. Bring her daughter, sit her quietly in the corner of the kitchen with a coloring book, and pray nobody noticed. For the first hour it worked. Yolanda moved through the party with practiced grace, refilling glasses, clearing plates, keeping half an eye on the kitchen door where Nia sat coloring quietly, humming the same little tune Yolanda hummed every morning. Guests complimented the catering, the lighting, the flowers Yolanda herself had arranged it for that morning. A few of them even thanked her by name, which was rare enough that she noticed it, tucked the small warmth of it away for later. Nathan found her near the bar around 8 o'clock, looking uncharacteristically relaxed. His tie loosened, a genuine smile on his face that Yolanda hadn't seen in months. "This is perfect, Yolanda. Truly. I don't know what I'd do without you running this place." "Just doing my job, sir." "No." He shook his head, more serious than the moment called for. "It's more than a job the way you do it. I mean that." It was, she would think later, the kindest thing he'd said to her in 10 years, and it arrived less than an hour before everything fell apart. Then Bianca decided to make an entrance. She walked onto the terrace in a dress the color of good champagne, and the guests turned like sunflowers toward her. And Nathan, sweet, distracted, hopeful Nathan, raised his glass and called for everyone's attention. "I just want to say," he began, his voice warm with the particular joy of a man who believes his life is finally coming together, "that I never thought I'd find someone who understood this life. Pressure. Pace. Bianca gets it. Bianca gets me." Applause. Champagne glasses lifted. Somewhere near the kitchen door, Yolanda stood holding a tray of appetizers, watching, saying nothing the way she always did. That was when Nia wandered out from the kitchen, drawn by the lights and the music, and made her way toward her mother's side, tugging gently at the hem of Yolanda's apron. Bianca's eyes found the child immediately. What happened next took less than 90 seconds, and it would replay in Yolanda's mind for the rest of her life. Bianca crossed the terrace in 4 sharp steps, seized a pair of silver kitchen shears from the dessert table, the ones meant for cutting ribbon on the cake, and grabbed a fistful of Yolanda's hair before Yolanda even understood what was happening. "You want to bring your mess into my party." Bianca's voice was low, venomous, meant only for Yolanda's ears at first. "Let's give everyone something to actually look at." The shears closed. Once. Third time. Locks of Yolanda's hair. Hair she'd grown out for 3 years. Hair she braided every Sunday night while Nia sat on the bathroom counter humming along to the radio. Fell onto the marble terrace floor in front of 50 of Nathan's closest business associates. The music stopped. The quartet's bows froze mid-stroke. Yolanda stood perfectly still, her hands trembling at her sides, her scalp burning, humiliation crawling up her spine like fire. She could feel every eye on the terrace fixed on her. She could feel the tray in her hand shaking. She did not cry. She would not give Bianca that. Instead, and this was the detail that would break Nathan's heart into 1,000 pieces later, Yolanda straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and though her eyes were wet, a small, defiant, dignified smile spread across her face. A smile that said, "You cannot take anything else from me." Smile that said, "I am still standing." It was Nia who saw it first. Nia, 3 years old, barely tall enough to see over the dessert table, tugging on her mother's apron with one hand and pointing at her with the other. She turned toward Nathan, the only adult whose face she recognized as kind, the man who sometimes slipped her a cookie from the kitchen when her mother wasn't looking, and in a small, clear voice that somehow carried across the entire silent terrace, she said, "Look at her, sir. She's smiling." Nathan's glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble. Every guest turned to look, really look, at Yolanda for the first time in years. At the hair scattered across the floor. At the shears still in Bianca's hand. At the smile that hadn't broken, even now. And then Nia, still looking up at Nathan with a terrifying honesty only a 3-year-old can manage, asked the question that would end everything. "Is this what you give us, sir? After all the years my mama took care of your house? Is this our reward? What would you do if you were in Nathan's place? Tell us honestly in the comments." Nathan didn't remember crossing the terrace. He would tell people later that the next 30 seconds simply didn't exist in his memory, that his body had moved before his mind caught up. What he did remember was the weight of Bianca's wrist in his hand as he pulled the shears from her fingers. What he remembered was the heat that rushed up his neck, the roaring in his ears that drowned out the string quartet, the gasps of 50 guests who had come to celebrate a wedding and instead were watching one unravel in real time. "Explain this to me." His voice came out low, shaking, nothing like the smooth boardroom tone his employees knew. "Explain to me why you just did that. In my house. In front of my staff. In front of a child." Bianca's composure cracked for the first time all evening. She brought her brat to a private event. "Nathan, someone had to draw a line." "A line." The word tore out of him. "You took shears to her hair like she was livestock at auction." His hand moved before the rest of him caught up. An open palm across Bianca's cheek, sharp enough to silence the terrace completely, sharp enough that even Bianca, for one stunned second, said nothing at all. He regretted it instantly. Not because she didn't deserve consequences. She did. But because he understood, even in that white-hot moment, that violence solved nothing, that his own anger had briefly made him someone he didn't recognize. He stepped back, breathing hard, and turned instead toward his head of security standing near the terrace doors. "Call the police. Now." "Nathan." Bianca's voice had gone thin, desperate. "Nathan, you cannot be serious. Think about the wedding, think about what people will say." "I am thinking about what people will say. I'm thinking about what they'll say when they hear you assaulted a woman who has worked in my home for a decade, in front of her own daughter, because you decided she wasn't worth basic human decency." The police arrived within 12 minutes. Bianca was escorted off the estate in handcuffs, still protesting, still insisting this was a misunderstanding, while 50 of Nathan's business associates watched in silence and pulled out their phones to text people who weren't even there. Yolanda stood frozen through all of it, one hand pressed to what remained of her hair, the other holding Nia against her hip. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't wanted a scene. She had wanted, for 10 years, only to keep her head down and her daughter fed. When the terrace finally cleared and the last guest's car pulled away down the long gravel drive, Nathan sat down heavily on the terrace steps. His elegant tuxedo jacket crumpled, his hands still shaking. "Yolanda." His voice cracked on her name. "I am so sorry. I don't know how I missed this. Any of it. How long has she?" "It doesn't matter now, sir. It matters to me." He looked up at her, and for the first time in 10 years, Yolanda saw something in his face that looked less like a boss and more like a man who had genuinely, finally woken up. "It matters because I let it happen. I was so buried in deals and meetings that I let someone treat you like you were invisible in my own home, and I never once asked if you were okay." There was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, where Yolanda considered saying it was fine, the way she always did, the way she'd trained herself to say for 10 years to keep the peace, to keep the job, to keep her daughter safe. The old habit rose up in her throat, ready to smooth everything over one more time. She didn't say it. "It wasn't fine, sir. It hasn't been fine for a while. I just didn't think anyone would believe me if I said so." Nathan nodded slowly, like the words had physical weight. "I believe you now. And I should have believed you before you ever had to prove it." Nia, exhausted, had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder sometime during the police interviews, one small fist curled into the collar of Yolanda's uniform. Nathan looked at the sleeping child for a long moment. She's the one who saw it, he said quietly. Before any of us. She's 3 years old, and she saw more clearly than I did in 10 years of walking past your mother every single morning. The days after the party were strange, heavy ones. Reporters somehow caught wind of the story. A socialite arrested at her own engagement party for assaulting a member of the household staff. And for a week, Yolanda couldn't check her phone without seeing some version of her own humiliation retold as headline entertainment. She kept her phone off most days. She didn't need strangers' opinions to know what had happened to her. Marcus showed up at her door one evening with a casserole dish his wife had made, and the two of them sat on Yolanda's small back porch while Nia napped inside. "You did the right thing, staying quiet as long as you could," Marcus said. "Wasn't your job to fix what she was doing. But I'm glad it's over." "It doesn't feel over," Yolanda admitted. "Feels like it just started. Everybody looking at me different now. Some of them with pity. Some of them like I did something wrong by having a child who spoke up. Some folks will always find a way to blame the one who got hurt," Marcus said. "Don't you let that settle in you. That little girl did something most grown adults in that house didn't have the courage to do in 10 years. Don't let anybody make you feel small about that." Yolanda almost smiled at that. A real one this time, without the defiance underneath it. It was the first moment since the party that she'd felt something close to steady. Nathan, for his part, spent that week doing something none of his employees had ever seen him do. He canceled meetings. He sat with his lawyer reviewing every financial document Bianca had touched over the past 6 months, and what he found there made him sick to his stomach. Forged authorizations, inflated vendor invoices, money quietly funneled into accounts with her name and only her name on them. It hadn't been love that brought her to his door. Had been arithmetic. Have you ever had to rebuild trust from absolutely nothing? The weeks that followed were quiet in a way the Whitfield house had never been quiet before. Bianca's case moved through the legal system efficiently, aided by 50 witness statements and security footage Nathan hadn't even known existed until his lawyer requested it. She accepted a plea deal rather than risk trial. The wedding, of course, never happened. The engagement ring went into a drawer that Nathan never opened again. But the real change in the house wasn't legal. It was smaller than that, and it happened in the mornings. Nathan started coming downstairs before his first call instead of during it. He started noticing things. The specific way Yolanda hummed old hymns while she worked, the way Marcus favored his left knee after 30 years of gardening, the way the whole household had quietly kept his life running while he'd been too busy building an empire to see any of them as people. He gave Yolanda a raise that finally matched what she was actually worth, not what the market said a housekeeper should earn. He offered to cover a proper daycare for Nia, no strings attached, no more sick days spent worrying. Yolanda, for the first time in a decade, didn't have to choose between her job and her daughter. Something else changed too, slower and quieter than the raise or the daycare. Nathan started asking questions. Real ones. He asked Marcus about his knee and arranged for him to see a specialist. He asked the cook, an older woman named Denise, why she always seemed to leave right as dinner service ended, and learned she was caring for a sick husband at home. He adjusted her hours without being asked twice. He began treating the people who ran his house like the foundation they had always been, instead of furniture that happened to move on its own. Yolanda watched all of it happen with a kind of quiet disbelief. 10 years she'd worked in that house believing invisibility was simply the cost of the job. It had taken her daughter's honesty, and Nathan's willingness to actually hear it, to prove her wrong. But money wasn't the thing that mattered most. What mattered was smaller, and it happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning 3 months later. Nathan had been asked to speak at a charity gala honoring local business leaders, and instead of the usual polished speech about growth and innovation his assistant had drafted for him, he stood at the podium and told a different story. He talked about a house he'd built with steel and glass and money, and how it had taken a 3-year-old girl to show him it was hollow. He talked about how easy it is for people with power to stop seeing the people who hold their lives together, until someone small enough, honest enough, and brave enough points at the truth everyone else is too afraid to say out loud. I didn't figure this out, he told the room. A little girl did. She looked at her mother, who had just been humiliated in front of 50 strangers, and she saw dignity where the rest of us saw only spectacle. She asked me a question I'll never forget. Is this what you give us after everything we've done for you? I want to spend the rest of my life making sure the answer is no. Never again. Yolanda, sitting in the third row that night in a dress Nathan had insisted on buying her. Her hair grown back in soft curls she now wore proudly short, felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. Not gratitude exactly. Something closer to being seen. Nia sat beside her mother, swinging her legs under the banquet chair, entirely unaware that she had changed the direction of 2 adults' lives with 11 honest words spoken at exactly the right moment. The moral of it all was simple, and Nathan said it best in the quiet car ride home that night, Nia asleep between them, her small hand still holding tight to her mother's sleeve even in sleep. The people who matter most in our lives are so often the ones we stop noticing, he said softly. And sometimes it takes someone too young to know better, to remind the rest of us how to see clearly again. If there's one thing this story leaves you with, let it be this. Notice the people who hold your world together before someone else has to point it out for you. Say the thank you today. Don't wait for a crisis to see clearly. Because sometimes, the wisest voice in the room belongs to the smallest person in it. If this story moved you even a little, hit that like button right now. Do it for Yolanda, for every person who's ever been made to feel invisible in a room full of people who should have known better. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, real and raw, landing every single week, straight from the heart. Now I want to hear from you. Has a child in your life ever said something that changed how you saw everything? Tell me in the comments, I read everyone. And if you know someone who needs a reminder to notice the people around them, send this their way today. It might mean more than you think. Thank you for being here with me tonight. Until next time, take care of each other.